He told me not to show up, said I'd ruin Mom's birthday, so I stayed quiet and let my success speak for itself. My name is Clara Evans. I'm 31 years old. 2 days before my mother's 65th birthday, I got the call. My phone lit up with my brother's name, Mark, and my stomach tightened. It always did. It wasn't an invitation. It was a warning. His voice was smooth, confident. It was the same voice he used to win debates in law school and charm my parents' friends at dinner parties. It was the voice of the golden child. Clara, listen, he started. No hello, no how are you. Mom's birthday dinner is kind of a big deal. Her friends, Dad's investors, important people. So maybe it's best if you skip this one. The air in my small apartment suddenly felt thin. I was sitting at my desk, looking at spreadsheets that represented years of my life, but all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator. Why? The word came out as a whisper. Mark sighed. It was a practiced sound, filled with the exhaustion of someone who has to deal with a difficult, unreasonable person. Me. I was the difficult, unreasonable person. You wouldn't fit the tone, he said, as if explaining something simple to a child. It's formal. We just don't want any awkward questions about what you've been doing. What I'd been doing. He said the words like I was a family secret, as if I'd spent the last 10 years hiding in a cave instead of building something that was about to make national headlines. The sting was sharp, familiar. It was a pain I had lived with for so long it felt like a part of me. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing was pointless. It only made them close ranks, leaving me further on the outside. So I said nothing. I just breathed in, held it and let it out slowly. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before I spoke. Sure, Mark, I understand, I whispered. And I did. I understood perfectly. In that moment, I understood exactly who my family thought I was, and I understood how wrong they were about to be. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. I grew up the shadow child, a role that was assigned to me so early I never thought to question it. Our house in the suburbs was a testament to my parents' ideals, pristine, orderly, and designed to impress. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the windows were always clean, and inside, the cream-colored furniture was never out of place. It was a house where you felt you should whisper, a place where a child's mess felt like a crime. My family operated much the same way. My father, Dr. Richard Evans, was a renowned surgeon, a man whose identity was built on precision and control. My mother, Eleanor, was his perfect partner, a woman whose main occupation was managing social appearances. Her calendar was a complex tapestry of charity luncheons, gallery openings, and dinner parties. Love in our home was transactional. It was earned through achievements that could be mentioned in a Christmas letter or boasted about at the country club. My brother, Mark, was a natural at this. He was born for their world. He was 2 years older than me and seemed to emerge from the womb with a blueprint for success already in his hands. He was the boy who not only won the regional spelling bee in 5th grade, but did so on a word so obscure my father had to look it up. I remember the party they threw for him afterward. The entire house was filled with my parents' friends, champagne glasses clinking. Mark stood in the center of the living room holding his trophy, his face beaming as my father rested a heavy, proud hand on his shoulder. "This one's going places," my father said to anyone who would listen. A real Evans. That same week I had won a small art competition at school. It was for a watercolor painting of the woods behind our house. My prize was a $20 gift certificate to a local art supply store. I remember running home, my certificate clutched in my hand, my heart thumping with a desperate need to share my own small victory. I found my mother in the kitchen, arranging flowers for Mark's party. I held up the certificate. "Look, Mom, I won!" She glanced down, her focus still on a stubborn rose stem. "Oh, that's lovely, dear," she said, a vague, pleasant smile on her face. "Why don't you go put that somewhere safe before it gets lost in all the excitement?" She never asked to see the painting. The certificate ended up in a drawer in my desk, and the moment was swallowed by the much larger, more important celebration of my brother. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was unintentional, a simple reflection of what they valued. Mark's achievements were solid, quantifiable, like bricks you could build a legacy with. My art was just a nice hobby, a decoration. This dynamic became the foundation of our lives. Mark's path was a straight, sunlit road paved with my parents' approval. He was captain of the debate team, class president, and accepted early into his first-choice Ivy League college. I, on the other hand, was a winding, overgrown path in the woods. I was quiet, I liked to read, and I filled notebooks with code for websites nobody ever saw. I was the creative one, a label that sounded like a compliment, but was really a polite way of saying, not like the rest of us. The defining moment, the one that truly set my course, was when I left law school. I had tried to walk their road. I went to a good university, got good grades, and was accepted into a prestigious law program. I packed my bags and went, determined to make them proud, to finally earn that heavy, proud hand on my shoulder. But the experience was like trying to breathe underwater. The airless libraries, the competitive classmates who talked about billable hours like it was a sacred text, the feeling of my own soul shrinking with every case I read. It was a nightmare. I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. After a year of misery, I called my father from my sterile dorm room. The phone felt cold against my ear. "Dad," I started, my voice trembling. "I can't do this. This isn't me. I want to come home." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't a thoughtful silence. It was a cold, disappointed one. "Don't be ridiculous, Clara," he finally said, his voice sharp, surgical. "You made a commitment. Evans don't quit. It's a temporary discomfort. You will adjust." But I knew I wouldn't. To continue would be to erase myself completely. So I did the one thing an Evans was never supposed to do. I quit. I packed my car, drove home, and stood in that perfect cream-colored living room to announce my new plan. "I'm going to start my own company," I told them. "An online business." My father stared at me, his jaw tight. The look in his eyes was one I'd never forget. It was pure, unadulterated disappointment. My mother just wrung her hands, her face a mask of social anxiety. "But what will we tell people?" she whispered, as if I'd been diagnosed with a shameful disease. They called it a phase. For the first 2 years, as I poured my savings into building a website and worked a part-time waitressing job to pay my rent, they would introduce me with an apologetic air. "Clara is exploring her options right now." When my venture struggled, when I had to borrow money from a friend to keep the servers running, their pity was palpable. It felt almost validating for them. My failure confirmed their worldview. The winding path had led to a dead end, just as they'd predicted. Then, slowly, things started to shift. My company, Repose, began to find its footing. It was a wellness platform for women, a project born from my own feelings of anxiety and isolation. The user base grew. I started making enough money to quit waitressing. I hired my first intern. To my family, this slow burn of success was confusing. It didn't fit their narrative, so they gave it a new name, my hobby. I remember one specific Sunday dinner. It was a few years after I'd started, and I'd just hit a major milestone, 100,000 active users. To me, it was a universe of people. It was proof that my idea wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a community. I waited for a lull in the conversation, my heart doing a nervous flutter. "I have some good news," I announced. "Repose just hit 100,000 users." My dad looked up from his roast beef, a polite but blank expression on his face. 100,000 what? "Users," I repeated. "People who use the platform every month." He said, taking a sip of wine. "That's nice. Is that a lot?" He turned to my brother. "Mark, how is that merger going at the firm? Your mother tells me you're leading the team." And that was it. My universe of 100,000 people was dismissed with a single, uninterested syllable. I felt a hot flush of shame, as if I'd been foolish to even bring it up. I spent the rest of the dinner in silence, pushing peas around my plate, feeling small and utterly invisible. The final door slammed shut about a year later. My father's surgical practice had a website that was ancient. It was clunky, difficult to navigate, and looked terrible on a phone. I spent a week putting together a detailed proposal, complete with mock-ups from my best designer and a marketing strategy to attract new patients. I was proud of it. It was professional, sleek, and it was a way for my two worlds to finally connect, for me to use my skills to help him. I presented it to him in his study, laying the printed mock-ups on his large oak desk. He looked them over, his expression unreadable. He tapped a finger on the logo concept. He listened quietly as I explained the user-friendly interface and the patient portal. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me, not as a father, but as a potential client dismissing a vendor. "This is quite thorough, Clara," he said, his voice laced with a cool formality. "Thank you for the effort. However, we have a marketing firm we work with. We prefer to keep things professional. Professionals." The word hung in the air between us. I was the CEO of a tech company. I managed a team of designers, engineers, and marketers who were some of the best in the field. But to my own father, I was an amateur, a child playing with a chemistry set. I gathered my papers, my hands feeling clumsy. "Of course," I said, my voice tight. "I understand." I drove home that night with a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I didn't cry. I felt something beyond tears. It was a moment of absolute clarity. They would never see me. They were incapable of it. Their definition of success was so narrow, so rigid, that anything outside of it was invisible. I walked into my apartment, turned on my computer, and got to work. I stopped hoping for their approval. I stopped trying to translate my life into a language they could understand. I decided that if I was going to be invisible to them, I would use that invisibility. I would build my world in the shadows they cast, and I would make it so bright it would one day be impossible for them to ignore. The decade that followed was built on silence and sacrifice. My life contracted until it was composed of 3 locations: my small apartment, my office, and the coffee shop in between. While my family's world was expanding with social events, European vacations, and promotions, mine was a deep dive into a singular, all-consuming focus. I was a ghost at my own family gatherings, a polite smile and a quiet presence at the edge of the room, but my real life, the one that held all my passion and energy, happened in the hours when they were all asleep. The grind was relentless. There were nights when I'd fall asleep at my desk, my cheek pressed against the cool surface, only to be woken by the sunrise streaking through the office window. I remember one particularly brutal week when we were pushing a major app update. A critical bug had appeared, a ghost in the machine that threatened to crash the entire system. For 72 straight hours, my lead engineer and I lived on stale coffee and the vending machine's sad supply of granola bars. We coded, tested, failed, and coded again. My eyes burned, my back ached, and I felt a bone-deep exhaustion I had never known. When we finally found the broken line of code at 4 a.m. on a Thursday, we didn't cheer. We just stared at the screen in disbelief, too tired to celebrate. I drove home through deserted streets, the city quiet and asleep, and felt a profound sense of loneliness. I had just saved my company, but there was no one to tell. Repose grew out of this relentless effort. It became more than a business. It was my entire world. I knew the names of my first 1,000 users. I read every piece of feedback, every email, every story they shared on our community boards. These women, strangers from all over the world, felt more like my family than my own blood. They saw me, they saw the value in what I was building, because it was helping them. We grew from a small startup in a cramped, rented office that always smelled faintly of burnt popcorn to a respected company with a beautiful, light-filled space downtown. I hired my first employee, a brilliant young woman named Sarah, and I remember the terror and excitement of being responsible for someone else's paycheck. Together, we hired more people: engineers, designers, therapists, marketers. My team was my tribe. They were passionate, smart, and they believed in our mission. We hit milestones that should have been shouted from the rooftops. We secured our first round of seed funding, a moment that felt like finally being able to breathe after being underwater for years. We were featured in tech journals. We won an award for innovation in digital health. We launched a partnership with a major university to study the effects of mindfulness on student anxiety. I became a CEO, a title that felt both heavy and unbelievably validating. I was responsible for the livelihoods of 80 people and for a platform that served millions of women. It was a weight that I carried with pride, but in my parents' house, none of it mattered. My achievements were written in a language they refused to learn. Holidays became exercises in quiet endurance. I would sit at their perfectly set dining table, the good china gleaming under the chandelier, and listen to the familiar cadence of their lives. Dad would recount a complex surgery, using medical terms like a secret code that bonded him with Mark, who would nod along with performative understanding. Mom would detail the politics of her garden club or the seating chart for an upcoming charity gala. And Mark, my perfect brother, would hold court. He spoke of million-dollar deals, of senior partners, of courtrooms and judges. His was a world of tangible success, of power and prestige that my parents understood. They would eventually, inevitably, turn to me. It was always an afterthought, a quick, polite check-in before the conversation moved on. "And how is your little project going, Clara?" my father might ask, his attention already drifting toward the wine bottle. "It's going well," I would say, trying to keep my voice even. "We're actually launching in the UK next month." "Oh, that's nice," my mother would chime in, her smile pleasant and vacant. "Did you hear, Mark? The Hendersons are putting in a pool. Can you imagine the disruption?" And just like that, my international expansion was equated with neighborhood gossip. It wasn't that they were actively trying to hurt me. It was that my world was so foreign, so outside their prescribed definition of a successful life, that they simply couldn't see it. It was a blind spot they had no interest in correcting. To them, I was still the girl who quit law school, the daughter who chose a strange, unstable path. My success was incomprehensible, so they downsized it. They mentally shrunk it down until it was small enough to fit into the box they had built for me, the box labeled disappointment. The Christmas I turned 29 was the breaking point. It was the moment the last flickering ember of hope finally died. Repose had just been featured in a national business magazine. It was a full-page spread, a deep dive into our mission and our growth. It wasn't a small tech blog. It was a mainstream publication that sat on newsstands across the country. My photo was there, a professional headshot where I looked confident and calm, the leader I had become. I bought 10 copies. I brought one with me to Christmas dinner, my heart a foolish, hopeful drum against my ribs. This, I thought, this is something they can understand. This is real. I waited until after the presents were opened. Mark had received a sleek, expensive watch from my parents. I had received a beige cashmere sweater. I pulled the magazine from my bag and laid it on the coffee table. My hands were trembling slightly. I wanted to show you guys something, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My company was featured in this. My mother picked it up. She adjusted her reading glasses, her brow furrowed in concentration. She found the article and stared at my picture for a long, silent moment. I held my breath, waiting. A word of praise, a flicker of pride, anything. She looked up, and the smile she gave me was the brightest, most devastatingly dismissive smile I had ever seen. She patted my hand. "Well, look at you," she said, her voice light and airy. "It's so nice that you're keeping busy with your little online thing." A little online thing. The words fell into the silent room and shattered something deep inside me. All the years of 16-hour days, the missed birthdays, the canceled plans, the constant stress, the weight of an entire company on my shoulders, all of it, in her eyes, was just a quaint little hobby to keep me from being bored. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the magazine in the fireplace. I wanted to tell her about the stock options and the revenue growth and the millions of women whose lives were better because of my little thing. But I didn't. I just smiled back. It was the hardest smile I've ever had to produce. It felt like my face was cracking. "Yes," I said, my voice as airy as hers. "It keeps me busy." I excused myself and went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the ornate mirror. I didn't cry. I felt a strange and terrible calm. The person in the magazine, the confident CEO, felt like a stranger. The person in the mirror was the shadow child, the disappointment. And in that moment, I understood that to my family, that's all I would ever be. The quiet resolve that settled in me that night was cold and hard as steel. I was done. I was done seeking their approval. I was done trying to be seen. My work, my success, my life, it was mine. And I would no longer offer it up to them for judgment. I would keep building my world, but from now on, the door to it would be locked. They didn't have the key. They didn't even know it existed. When I hung up the phone after Mark's call, the silence I was left with was different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a presence. It filled my apartment, pressing in from all sides, heavy with years of unspoken words and unmet expectations. His voice still echoed in my ears. "You wouldn't fit the tone. We just don't want any awkward questions." I walked over to my couch and sank into it. The crisp, professional suit I'd worn to the office that day suddenly feeling like a costume. For a few minutes, I just stared at a framed photo on my bookshelf. It was from a family vacation to the coast a decade ago. We were all smiling. My father had his arm around my mother. Mark was standing tall and confident, and I was on the edge of the frame, my smile a little smaller, a little less certain than the others. Even then, I was slightly separate. We looked like the perfect family, but the photograph was a lie. It captured a single polished moment, but it couldn't show the cracks that were already spreading beneath the surface. My pain wasn't sharp anymore. It was a chronic condition, a dull ache I had learned to live with. Mark's words were just a confirmation of a diagnosis I already had. In my own family, I was an outsider, an inconvenience. My existence was a potential source of awkwardness that needed to be managed. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a harsh sound in the quiet room. My chest tightened with a pathetic, involuntary flicker of hope. Maybe it's Mom. Maybe she's calling to say Mark is an idiot and of course I have to be there. It was a childish wish, the lingering ghost of a girl who just wanted her mother. I picked it up. It was a text from my dad. "Please don't take offense, Clara. We just want the night to run smoothly." I read the message once, then again, and a third time. Each word was chosen with such careful, surgical precision. Please don't take offense. A preemptive strike against my feelings. A command to swallow my hurt so they wouldn't have to deal with it. We just want the night to run smoothly. This was the part that truly broke me. I was the bump in the road. I was the potential disruption to their perfectly curated evening. My presence, my life, my very being was an obstacle to smoothness. It was so much worse than Mark's blunt cruelty. My father's text was a carefully worded, logical dismissal. It was a rational decision made by the patriarch of the family, and it meant the decision was final. It was official. I was not wanted, and my mother. The silence from her was the most damning evidence of all. I could picture the scene in their immaculate home so clearly. Mark would have told them he'd handled the Clara situation. My father would have nodded in agreement, framing it as a practical necessity. And my mother, whose entire life was dedicated to avoiding conflict and maintaining a flawless social facade, would have quietly acquiesced. Her silence was her signature on the decree of my exile. She would not risk an uncomfortable scene, not even for her own daughter. Not on a night when her important friends would be there. I put the phone down, face up on the cushion next to me. I didn't throw it. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling a profound and unshakable sense of finality. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a temporary slight. This was the culmination of 31 years of being the other. The lesser, the one who didn't fit. The tiny, stubborn hope I had carried inside me for so long. The hope that one day they would wake up and finally see me, flickered and died. It didn't just go out. It was snuffed out, deliberately and efficiently, by the two people who had given me life. I stood up and walked to my large window that overlooked the city. The lights of Boston were beginning to sparkle as dusk settled. Down below, thousands of people were living their lives, completely unaware of the quiet death of hope happening in my apartment. For years, I had felt like I was living a double life. There was the Clara who went to family dinners and tried to be small and agreeable. And then there was the Clara who was the CEO of a successful company, a leader who was respected and admired by her team. I had been trying to merge those two worlds, trying to get my family to see and acknowledge the second Clara. Now I knew that was impossible. The bridge between those worlds was a smoldering ruin. Okay, I whispered to my reflection in the dark glass. The word was not one of defeat. It was one of release. I was letting go. I was letting go of the need for their approval. I was letting go of the hurt. I was letting go of the endless, exhausting effort of trying to be worthy in their eyes. I was not angry. Anger felt hot and pointless. What I felt was a cold, clear focus, a strange sense of calm. They had made their choice. They had chosen a smooth party over their daughter. They had chosen appearances over love, and now I was going to make mine. I walked back to my desk, my steps steady and sure. I turned on my laptop. The screen came to life, displaying the Repose dashboard, my world. A world of data, growth, and community. A world I had built from nothing while they were looking the other way. They thought they were cutting me out. They thought they were protecting their perfect evening from my awkward, disappointing presence. They had no idea they had just handed me the script for my own liberation. They wanted a quiet night. They wanted to avoid questions. A small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time that day. I opened my email and found the one I was looking for, the one from my legal team. The subject line seemed to glow on the screen. It was all planned. The timing was set. They had no idea that the quiet daughter they had just uninvited was about to become the loudest person in the room. The secret I had been keeping was a universe away from their small, controlled world. While they worried about guest lists and catering, I was navigating the most complex and high-stakes negotiation of my life. For 2 solid months, my existence had been a whirlwind of encrypted emails, confidential video calls, and flights to New York that I told my family were work trips. A vague explanation they never bothered to question. Trinity Health Tech wasn't just any company. They were a titan in the industry, a global conglomerate known for acquiring and scaling innovative health startups. When they first approached me, I thought it was a mistake. I sat in my office, staring at the email from their head of acquisitions, and my first reaction was a jolt of imposter syndrome. They must have the wrong Clara Evans. But they didn't. They had been watching Repose for over a year. They had seen our user growth, our engagement rates, our potential to become a household name in women's wellness. They didn't see a little online thing. They saw a powerhouse. The negotiation process was a brutal education. It was a high-stakes chess match played by people who were masters of the game. There was a point, about a month in, when I thought the whole thing would collapse. We were on a late-night video call haggling over the valuation. Their team was aggressive, trying to lowball me, questioning my projections, picking apart my business model. I remember feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, the weight of my team's future and my own life's work pressing down on me. The old voices of doubt, The ones that sounded a lot like my father whispered in my ear, "You're not good enough for this. You're out of your league." But then I looked at the faces of my own team on the screen, my CFO and my COO, who were looking to me for guidance, and something hardened inside me. I had built this company from nothing. I had fought for every user, every dollar, every small victory. I was not going to let these men in suits intimidate me. I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and calmly and methodically dismantled their arguments, using my own data, my own deep knowledge of my market. I held my ground. The call ended in a stalemate, but the tone had shifted. I had earned their respect. The next day, they came back with a new offer. The number was so large it felt like a typo. $410 million. I said it out loud to myself in my empty apartment that night, just to hear the sound of it. It wasn't just money. It was a valuation of my time, my sacrifice, my vision. It was the number that represented every family dinner I'd sat through in silence, every holiday I'd spent working, every time my father had called my work a hobby. It was a number so loud it could not be ignored. After weeks of due diligence and endless mountains of paperwork, we set the closing date, Friday, the Friday before my mother's 65th birthday. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. The timing was so perfect, so poetic, it felt like a scene from a movie. My family was meticulously planning my exclusion, while I was quietly orchestrating my ascension. On that Friday morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. The anxiety of the past few months had vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. I didn't choose a power suit. I chose a simple, elegant dark blue dress. It was my armor, but it was armor that felt like my own skin. I took a taxi through the morning traffic, watching the city wake up. I thought about the girl I had been when I started this journey, working from a corner in her bedroom, filled with doubt, but driven by a stubborn, desperate need to create something that was truly hers. I wished I could tell her what was about to happen. The Trinity Health Tech headquarters was a cathedral of glass and steel. Their conference room was on the top floor, with a panoramic view of the entire city. It felt like being on top of the world. The room was already filled with the key players, lawyers, executives, board members. They all stood when I walked in. They shook my hand. They called me Clara. There was a level of respect in that room that I had never once felt in my own parents' home. The signing itself was almost ceremonial, a stack of documents, each one requiring my signature. The pen felt heavy and powerful in my hand. With each stroke, I felt like I was not just signing a contract, but rewriting my own story. With the signature on the share purchase agreement, I was silencing my father's dismissal. With the one on the employment contract that named me president of the new division, I was erasing my mother's pitying glances. Each signature was a quiet act of rebellion, a final answer to a lifetime of being underestimated. When the last page was signed, a polite, satisfied applause broke the silence. Champagne was brought in. Mr. Harrison, the CEO of Trinity, raised his glass to me. "To Clara Evans," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "A true visionary. You've built something remarkable. Congratulations." Everyone drank. I felt a genuine warmth spread through my chest. This was real. This was earned. This was mine. As we were gathering our things, Mr. Harrison walked over to me. "You must be looking forward to celebrating with your family this weekend," he said with a warm smile. "They must be incredibly proud of you." The irony was so thick I could taste it. I thought of the party that was being prepared, the formal affair where I wouldn't fit the tone. I thought of my brother's warning, my father's text, my mother's complicit silence. They were so busy protecting their perfect world from me, they had no idea I had just built an empire outside their walls. A slow, knowing smile spread across my face. It wasn't bitter. It was serene. "Yes," I replied, my voice perfectly even as I met his gaze. "My family will be surprised." After I hung up on Mark, I didn't move. I just sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the phone resting on my knee. The sun had set, and the city lights were beginning to paint soft patterns on my living room wall. There was no anger, no triumphant surge of adrenaline. There was only a profound and steady calm. For years, I had felt like a planet knocked out of its orbit, spinning alone in the dark. Now I felt the quiet, immense pull of my own gravity. I was my own center. My PR team and I had planned this meticulously. The press release was queued up, set to go live on the national wire at exactly 6 p.m. The timing was deliberate. It was late enough to catch the evening news cycle, but early enough to dominate the conversation for the rest of the night. It was also, I knew, the exact moment the cocktail hour at my mother's birthday party would be in full swing. I spent the next hour in a state of suspended animation. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, the simple ritual of boiling water and steeping the bag feeling grounding. I thought about my team, who were having their own small celebration at a bar downtown. They had invited me, but I had declined. This was a moment I needed to face alone. This wasn't about the money or the success. It was about the quiet closing of a door to a room I had been trying to get into my entire life, and the realization that the universe I wanted was one I had already built for myself on the other side. At 5:59 p.m., my laptop pinged. It was a message from Megan, my head of communications. 1 minute to launch. Ready to change the world? I smiled and typed back a simple response. It's time. I watched the clock on my screen turn to 6:04 p.m. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The world felt exactly the same. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a siren, the gentle steam rising from my mug. And then, my world exploded. It started with an email. The subject line was, "Congratulations," from an old college friend I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Then another, and another. My inbox, which I had cleared only an hour before, began to fill at an astonishing rate. Tech bloggers, industry analysts, former colleagues, even my old landlord. The notifications piled on top of each other, a digital avalanche. Then my phone began to buzz. It was a text from Sarah, my first ever employee. "Holy's Clara, we're on the Boston Globe homepage." I clicked the link she sent. And there it was, my face, looking back at me from a professional headshot, next to a headline that felt like it was from someone else's life. Boston startup Repose. Acquired by Trinity Health Tech for $410 million. CEO Clara Evans leads, one of the largest female-led health tech exits of the decade. My phone didn't just buzz anymore. It began to vibrate continuously, a frantic, insistent hum against the wood of my coffee table. It was like a wild animal trying to get my attention. Texts poured in one after another. LinkedIn notifications, Instagram tags. I glanced at the screen and saw the names flashing. Friends from high school, distant cousins, people whose existence I had almost forgotten. They were all reaching out now, sending exclamation points and emojis, wanting to touch this sudden, spectacular success. I let it vibrate. I watched it, a detached observer, as the world learned my secret. At 6:20 p.m., a number I didn't recognize called. I ignored it. Then another. I let it go to voicemail. I knew my family would be the last to hear. They didn't follow the tech news. The information would have to find them, trickling into their perfectly insulated world through the whispers of their guests. At 6:31 p.m., my mother's name flashed on the screen. I picked up the phone, my hand perfectly steady. I took a sip of my now lukewarm tea and pressed the button. "Hello, Mom. Clara?" "Oh my God, are you seeing this?" Her voice was high-pitched, a frantic, breathless sound I had never heard before. It was the voice of someone whose carefully constructed reality had just been shattered. "Yes, Mom, I'm seeing it," I said calmly. I wrote the press statement. There was a moment of confused silence. You wrote it? What are you talking about?" "Carol just showed me an article on her phone. They're showing your picture on the TV in the ballroom. Everyone here is talking about it. Why didn't you tell us?" The question hung in the air, so full of absurdity that I almost laughed. "Why didn't I tell you? Because you told me my life's work was a little thing. Because you never asked. Because you thought my presence would ruin your party. You never asked," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "What?" she stammered. In the background, I could hear a rising tide of noise, the chatter of dozens of confused and excited guests. Their polished party was becoming a spectacle. Then I heard another voice, muffled but unmistakable. It was Mark, yelling in the background, his voice tight with panic. "Give me the phone! Tell her to come over right now. We need to explain this to people." "Explain what?" I thought. "Explain that you had no idea your own sister was a multimillionaire? Explain that the family embarrassment was actually the most successful person in the room?" They didn't need an explanation. They needed a strategy. They needed to control the narrative. But the narrative was no longer theirs to control. My mother came back on the line, her voice pleading. "Clara, please, you have to come down here. Everyone is asking questions. Your father is surrounded. Mark says you need to be here." I thought of myself, sitting on my comfortable couch, wearing soft pajamas, a world away from their gilded cage of a country club. They hadn't wanted me there an hour ago. Now they needed me there. My presence had gone from being a liability to an asset. I was no longer a potential embarrassment. I was a trophy they desperately needed to display. A true, genuine smile touched my lips. The power I felt in that moment was immense, but it was quiet. It was the power of stillness. The power of saying no. "You made it very clear I wasn't welcome, remember?" I said, my voice soft, letting each word land. I'd hate to ruin the party. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. And then, nothing. I didn't wait for a response. I pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the couch. The vibrations finally stopped, and the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I spent the rest of my evening in peaceful defiance of the chaos I knew was erupting across town. I didn't turn on the news or scroll endlessly through social media. Instead, I ordered a pizza, put on a movie I'd seen a dozen times, and sat curled up on my couch. My phone, which I had put on silent, would light up every few seconds on the cushion beside me, a frantic beacon from a world that had suddenly decided I was important. Each flash of light was a reminder of the frantic conversations, the stunned faces, and the social implosion happening at my mother's 65th birthday party. Though I wasn't there, I could picture it perfectly. I had been to enough of their events at the Belmont Country Club to imagine the scene. The grand ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and overpriced flower arrangements. The men in their tailored suits, talking about stocks and golf. The women in their cocktail dresses, their laughter like the tinkling of ice in a glass. Their conversations a delicate dance of gossip and one-upmanship. Into this controlled, predictable environment, my news had landed like a bomb. I imagined my mother, Eleanor, her face a pale mask of a smile. Her friend Carol, a woman whose life revolved around knowing everything about everyone, would have her cornered by the bar. "Eleanor, you sly thing," Carol would say, her voice dripping with false admiration. "Keeping your daughter's incredible success a secret all this time. A $400 million company." We're all just speechless. My mother, who valued social currency above all else, would have none. She couldn't take credit for a victory she didn't know existed. She would stammer, trying to find the right words to explain her own ignorance without looking like a fool or, even worse, a neglectful mother. Then I pictured my father, Dr. Richard Evans, a man who commanded respect in the operating room and in the boardroom of his hospital. He would be surrounded by his colleagues and his investors, the important people Mark had been so worried about. One of them, a man named Dr. Albright who sat on the hospital's board, would clap him on the back, his voice booming. "Richard, my God, what a legacy! Your son, a top lawyer, and now your daughter, a tech mogul. You must be the proudest man in Boston tonight." My father, a man who hated being caught off guard, would be trapped. He couldn't lie and say he knew all along. The story was too big, the details too specific. His ignorance would be laid bare in front of the very people whose respect he craved most. The foundation of his authority, his image as a man in complete control, would be cracking right under his feet. But the most satisfying scene to imagine was the one with Mark, my brother, the golden child, the one who had always been the center of attention. I imagined his law firm's senior partner, a formidable man named Mr. Davenport, strolling over to him, a curious glint in his eye. "Mark," he'd say, swirling the brandy in his glass. "I just saw the news about your sister Clara. Remarkable, truly remarkable. Funny, you've never mentioned she was the CEO of Repose. I believe my wife uses that app." Mark's entire life was built on a narrative of effortless superiority. In his world, he was the success story. I was the cautionary tale. That single casual question from his boss would dismantle his entire identity in a public forum. It would expose him not just as being out of the loop, but as having fundamentally misjudged, dismissed, and hidden a sister who was, by any objective measure, far more successful than he was. His confidence would evaporate, replaced by the panicked, flailing energy of someone whose carefully crafted image had just been set on fire. My phone lit up with an Instagram notification. Someone had tagged me in a photo. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and looked. It was a blurry photo, taken from across the ballroom. It showed a group of guests huddled around one of the large TVs on the wall, the kind usually reserved for showing slideshows of the guest of honor. On the screen was my face, broadcast on the evening news. The caption read, "Craziest thing at the Evans party. Turns out the daughter they never talk about is a tech genius." Awkward, I had to smile. Their polished, perfect event, designed to celebrate my mother and impress their friends, had turned into a public relations crisis. The main topic of conversation at my mother's birthday party was the daughter she hadn't invited. My absence was a louder presence than anyone in the room. I finished my pizza and put the movie on pause. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. For years, I had tried so hard to be heard by them. I had brought my small victories to them like offerings, hoping for a crumb of acknowledgement, a whisper of praise. They had met my efforts with indifference and dismissal. They had made me feel that my voice was worthless. But tonight, I had learned a powerful lesson. Revenge wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about confrontation or anger. True revenge was living a life so full and successful that their opinion of it became irrelevant. It was about building your own world on your own terms. My silence over the years hadn't been weakness. It had been the quiet, steady work of laying a foundation. And tonight, the structure I had built was so tall, so bright, that it cast a shadow over everything else. My silence was finally speaking for me, and its voice was thunderous. I woke up the next morning to a world that felt fundamentally different. The sunlight streaming through my window seemed brighter, the air in my apartment clearer. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't wake up with the familiar low-grade ache of anxiety in my chest. I felt light. I felt free. I made coffee and opened my laptop, and the scale of what had happened began to sink in. I was no longer a private citizen. My inbox had over 1,000 new emails. There were interview requests from the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and a handful of major television networks. There were emails from venture capitalists who had passed on funding repos years ago, now writing notes full of transparently false praise and a desperate hope to be involved in whatever I did next. There were messages from women all over the world who used repos, sharing their stories and thanking me for building it. The local paper, the Boston Globe, had already published a feature story online. The headline was, "The Quiet Founder Who Changed Women's Wellness." They had somehow found an old picture of me from a college entrepreneurship competition. I looked so young, so nervous, my eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. The article told my story, pieced together from public records and interviews with old professors and industry colleagues. It painted a picture of a relentless, visionary founder who had worked in obscurity for a decade to build something meaningful. It was a narrative that was true, but it felt strange to see my quiet, lonely struggle transformed into a heroic public story. Then I picked up my phone. The screen was a minefield of notifications. And there, at the top of the list, were the messages I had been both dreading and expecting. One from each of them, a digital olive branch from a family who had set our bridge on fire. The first was a text from my mother, sent at 3:17 a.m. I didn't sleep all night. I keep replaying everything in my head. Everyone's talking about you. I don't know what to say to people. Please come by the house. We need to talk. I read her words, and I felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, detached. Her message wasn't about me. It was about her sleepless night, her social anxiety, her need to manage the story. We need to talk. It was a summons, not an invitation. It was a request for me to come and help her clean up the mess of her own making. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of my feelings. There was only her own panic. Next, there was a voicemail from my father, left at 6:45 a.m., just as he was probably getting ready to leave for the hospital. I pressed play and held the phone to my ear. His voice was strained, unfamiliar. The usual confident, authoritative tone was gone, replaced by a clumsy, hesitant cadence. "Clara, it's Dad." A long pause. I saw the news. Your mother is very upset. It's all quite unexpected." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him clear his throat. "Listen, we're proud of you." "Of course we are. We just didn't know. We just didn't know." The words were meant as an excuse, a justification for a decade of dismissal. But I heard them as a confession. It wasn't that they couldn't know. They had every opportunity. They just hadn't cared enough to find out. Their ignorance was a choice, a product of their own narrow worldview. His pride was a new development, born only when my success became public and undeniable. It was a pride in the outcome, not in the journey he had refused to witness. The last message was a text from Mark. It was the shortest, and in many ways, the most telling. A single sentence sent just minutes ago. "Guess we misjudged you." That was it. No apology, no remorse. Just a grudging admission of a factual error. It was the kind of statement you make after a stock you bet against suddenly soars. It was an acknowledgement of his own flawed analysis, not of the pain his judgment had caused me. He hadn't misjudged a business venture. He had misjudged his own sister. He had erased my worth, and his only response was a flippant concession that his calculations were off. I looked at the 3 messages, a trifecta of self-serving, inadequate attempts at reconciliation. A year ago, even 6 months ago, I would have leaped at them. I would have felt a surge of relief and called my mother immediately, ready to accept any crumb of affection they were willing to offer. But standing in my sunlit kitchen, I felt nothing but a quiet sense of distance. Their emotional crisis was no longer my responsibility. Their discomfort was a consequence of their own actions, and I felt no obligation to soothe it. So I did something I had never done before. I ignored them. I put my phone down on the counter, screen side down. I didn't reply to my mother's demand, my father's excuse, or my brother's concession. I let them sit in the silence they had so often condemned me to. Instead, I got dressed and went to meet my team for breakfast. I had booked a table at a small restaurant that we used to go to in the early days, back when we were just a handful of people crammed into a tiny office. When I walked in, they all stood up and applauded, not because I was a millionaire, but because we had done it, together. Sarah, my first employee, hugged me, tears in her eyes. "I am so proud of you, Clara," she whispered. We sat for hours, eating pancakes and drinking coffee, remembering the hard times and laughing about the mistakes we'd made. We toasted not just to the acquisition, but to the journey, to the late nights, the impossible deadlines, and the shared belief in what we were building. These people were my family. They were the ones who had seen me, believed in me, and worked alongside me when no one else did. Their joy was pure and uncomplicated. Looking around the table at their happy, proud faces, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The messages on my phone were just words, hollow attempts to repair a relationship they had only valued once it became a status symbol. My family's apologies, if they ever came, weren't something I needed to hear. True apology wasn't about words. It was about change. It was about the hard, painful work of looking at your own behavior and deciding to be better. I didn't know if they were capable of that, but I knew I wasn't going to put my life on hold waiting to find out. Their chapter was over. My real story was just beginning. For 2 weeks, I let the silence stretch. I didn't return my family's calls or texts. It wasn't an act of punishment, but one of self-preservation. I needed space to adjust to my new reality, a world where I was suddenly a public figure. My days were a blur of meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and the transition team from Trinity Health Tech. I was making decisions that would shape the next chapter of my life and the future of the company I had built. For the first time, my world was entirely my own, and their frantic, self-involved attempts to reclaim a place in it felt like static from a distant station. I ignored the media requests, but I did read the articles. It was a strange out-of-body experience to see my quiet life dissected and mythologized. They called me relentless, a visionary, a genius, but they missed the central truth of my story. I wasn't just driven by ambition. I was driven by loneliness. Repose wasn't just a business plan. It was a home I had built for myself when my own family had locked the doors. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my mother called. This time I answered. Her voice was different. The frantic, high-pitched panic was gone, replaced by a quiet, hesitant tone I had never heard from her before. "Clara?" she said, as if she was surprised I had picked up. "Hi, Mom." There was a long pause. "I was wondering," she began, her voice soft, "if you would be willing to come for dinner on Sunday. Just us. Your father, Mark, and me. No one else. Just us." The words were a quiet admission of everything that had been wrong before. The parties, the investors, the important people, they were gone. She was asking for a family dinner, not a social event. It was the first sign of a crack in the facade. "Okay, Mom," I said. "I'll be there." When I pulled up to their house that Sunday, it looked exactly the same. The perfect lawn, the gleaming windows, the imposing front door. But as I walked up the stone path, I felt different. I wasn't the shadow child coming home to be judged. I was a guest, a visitor from another world, and I was here on my own terms. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell. She looked older than she had just a few weeks ago. The perfect social mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, naked vulnerability. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and when she looked at me, they filled with tears. "Clara," she whispered, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She hugged me, a real hug that was tight and desperate. When she pulled back, she didn't try to hide her tears. "You were right," she said, her voice breaking. "About everything. I was a fool. I spent so much time worrying about what Carol and the women at the club thought. I cared more about appearances than I did about my own daughter, and I missed it. I missed watching you become this incredible person." My father was standing in the doorway of the living room. He looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved in his pockets. He, the man of eloquent speeches at medical fundraisers, seemed to be at a complete loss for words. He cleared his throat. "Your mother is right," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. I failed you. There's no excuse, my pride. It blinded me." We moved into the living room, the one with the cream-colored furniture that I was never allowed to sit on with my shoes. Mark was standing by the fireplace, his usual confident posture replaced by a tense, awkward stillness. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first, but then he looked up and I saw something in his face I had never seen before. "Shame. Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "I was an arrogant jerk. What I said to you on the phone, it was unforgivable. You deserved so much better from us. from me. I'm sorry. I listened to them, to their confessions and their apologies. The anger and hurt that had lived inside me for so long had faded, leaving behind a calm, quiet clarity. There was no satisfaction in their pain, no triumph in their remorse. There was only a deep and profound sadness for all the years we had lost. I looked at them, my family, these 3 people who were practically strangers to me, and I finally spoke. My voice was even and steady. I didn't need you to believe in me, I said, and I saw them flinch at the truth of it. But I wish you'd wanted to. The words hung in the silent room, simple and honest. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was just giving them the truth they had never been willing to hear. I was telling them that my success was never the point. The point was that they were supposed to be my family. They were supposed to want to know me, regardless of whether I succeeded or failed. We ate dinner at the polished dining table, the same table where I had been ignored and dismissed for years. But tonight the dynamic was different. The conversation was stilted and awkward at first. They asked me questions about repose, questions filled with a genuine, if belated, curiosity. They asked about the early days, about the struggles, about the team I had built. I answered them simply, without embellishment or pride. I told them about sleeping in the office and the fear of not making payroll. I told them about Sarah, my first employee, and the joy of our first successes. I wasn't trying to impress them. I was just showing them the world they had refused to see. It wasn't a magical, happy ending. The deep wounds of a lifetime couldn't be healed over a single meal of roast chicken. The trust was gone, and the years of distance had built walls that would not easily crumble. But for the first time, we were all being honest. The performance was over. We were just a family, broken and flawed, sitting together in the quiet wreckage of our past, finally willing to see each other clearly. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That night, as I drove away from their house, I realized I had never truly needed their approval to be successful. I had already built something bigger than their limited expectations. Success wasn't my revenge. It was my liberation. It was the freedom to define my own worth, on my own terms. When my mother had hugged me at the door, she had whispered, "You didn't ruin my birthday. You saved my perspective." I finally smiled for real. The quietest person in the room had finally been heard. If you've ever been underestimated, told you don't belong, or cut out because they couldn't see your worth, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting your value. It's letting your silence echo with success.